family camping trip turned into a nightmare. I left the tent for a few minutes to use the bathroom. When I returned, the car and tent were gone. Mom, where is everyone? Under the lantern's light, I found a note. With trembling hands, I picked it up. It was my mother's handwriting. You two can live here now. My son and I were left behind in the dark forest. Soft spring sunlight streamed through the window of Marian Williams's apartment. She was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, occasionally glancing outside. Her 7-year-old son Jake was still in bed. School spring break had just begun, and she wanted him to conserve his energy for the family trip starting today. Jake, time to get up. Grandma and Grandpa will be here soon, Marian called. As if in response to her voice, the sound of small footsteps echoed in the hallway. Jake appeared in the kitchen in his pajamas, still rubbing his sleepy eyes. Good morning, Mom. We're going camping today. His words carried the innocent excitement unique to young boys. Marian couldn't help but smile. She would do anything for this child. That thought had been the driving force that sustained her as a single mother. Jake's father had left home just a year after he was born. Since then, Marian had somehow rebuilt her life with help from her mother Elizabeth and stepfather Robert. They were successful, wealthy insurance brokers who supported Marian and Jake financially. Elizabeth, in particular, had taken in and raised Marian after she lost her biological mother, Elizabeth's sister, when she was very young. What time is Grandma coming? Jake asked, scooping up his cereal. 9. Did you pack everything? Jake nodded, and the doorbell rang. The clock showed it was only 8:30. Her mother was as punctual as ever. When Marian opened the door, Elizabeth and Robert were standing there. Elizabeth looked remarkably young for 60, dressed in designer clothes with perfectly dyed blonde hair. Beside her, Robert was a tall man of 65, with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes. Good morning, Marian. Ready to go? Elizabeth said, giving Marian a light kiss. The scent of her perfume filled the room, almost. Just a few more things. Grandma. Jake came running over and hugged Elizabeth around the waist. Oh, my precious grandson, Elizabeth said in a slightly exaggerated tone, patting Jake's head. Are you ready for camping? Yes. I packed everything in my backpack. Robert walked into the living room and sat on the sofa. It's going to be a long journey. We're going deep into the mountains. Marian felt a bit anxious inside. The remote mountain campsite had been her mother and stepfather's suggestion. Neither she nor Jake were outdoor types, but when Elizabeth enthusiastically recommended it as a perfect opportunity to strengthen family bonds, Marian couldn't find a reason to refuse. You and Jake need more experiences with nature, Elizabeth said. Living in the city all the time suffocates the soul. Marian just smiled and nodded. Her relationship with her mother was complicated. Elizabeth was her benefactor who had taken her in and raised her, but sometimes there was a subtle coldness in her attitude. Marian occasionally felt that the fact she wasn't Elizabeth's biological daughter created an invisible wall between them. As they loaded the luggage into Robert's luxury SUV, Marian wondered if she should have listened to her instincts. For some reason, an ominous feeling had been haunting her about this trip, but when she saw Jake's excited face, such concern seemed trivial. Let's go, Elizabeth said. I found a wonderful place. We won't be disturbed by anyone. After a 5-hour drive, they finally left the paved road and turned onto a narrow gravel path. Jake peered out the window at the dense forest and let out excited little gasps each time the SUV bounced. The road became narrower, and the trees grew thicker. Marian felt her anxiety growing. Are you sure this is the right place? Marian asked Elizabeth in the front seat. I don't see any signs or ranger stations. Don't worry, Elizabeth looked at Marian through the mirror. We wanted a private experience. This is a special place a colleague of Robert's told us about. We won't be disturbed by anyone, literally no one. There seemed to be something cold in those words, but Marian dismissed the thought. Eventually the car arrived at a small clearing. It was surrounded by enormous pine trees with a small lake visible in the distance. It was certainly beautiful, but extremely isolated. There was no sign of other campers, no sounds of people or vehicles. Here we are, Robert announced, turning off the engine. Let's explore the area before setting up the tents. Jake jumped out of the car with an excited shout. Mom, look! There's a lake. Can I swim in it? It's probably too cold, Marian answered, looking at the quiet lake beyond the trees. The water looked dark and endlessly deep. As they unloaded their gear and set up tents, the sun gradually moved toward the mountains in the west. Robert and Elizabeth set up a large family tent, while Marian put up a smaller one for herself and Jake. Separate tents? Marian asked, somewhat surprised. You and Jake need your privacy, Elizabeth answered with a smile. Besides, Robert snores terribly. We wouldn't want to keep you up all night. While preparing dinner, Marian noticed that her mother was acting differently than usual. Elizabeth was unusually kind, laughing more than usual, and hugging Jake repeatedly. Robert also seemed strangely nervous, frequently checking his watch. As they ate around the campfire, Elizabeth suddenly began talking about the past. Do you remember your mother, my sister? Marian shook her head. Not really. I was only 4 when she died. She was a wonderful woman. Something flickered in Elizabeth's eyes, but she was always luckier than me. Especially she cut herself off. Never mind, Elizabeth abruptly changed the subject. Jake, would you like to toast some marshmallows? As the night wore on, Marianne began to feel tired. Jake was already half asleep. I'm going to use the bathroom. Marianne stood up and grabbed a flashlight. You're going into the forest? Elizabeth asked. Do I have another option? Marion replied with a small laugh. I'll be right back. Leave Jake here, Elizabeth said. He looks sleepy. Marion hesitated briefly but nodded. Jake, stay with Grandma, I'll be back soon. Jake nodded drowsily. Marianne walked into the forest away from the campsite, guided by the flashlight's beam. After finding a spot with enough privacy, she relieved herself and took out a sanitizing wipe from her bag. At that moment she thought she heard the sound of an engine in the distance. But in the darkness it was difficult to determine the direction of the sound. Must be my imagination, she told herself. As Marion made her way back to the campsite, she felt something was different. The forest seemed quieter than before. The sounds of birds, insects, even the wind seemed to have disappeared. Mom? The small voice made Marion jump. She pointed her flashlight to see Jake emerging from behind a tree. Jake, what are you doing? You were supposed to stay with Grandma. Grandma said wait a minute, so I waited, Jake answered in a trembling voice. But she didn't come back. So I came looking for you. Marion's heart began to race. She pointed her flashlight in the direction of the campsite and started walking quickly, tightly gripping Jake's small hand. Elizabeth? Robert? She called out. There was no response. When they returned to the campsite, Marianne froze. An unbelievable sight spread before her eyes as if in a dream. The tents, the car, the luggage, everything was gone. Mom, where is everyone? Jake's voice was trembling. Marion was speechless. Only the dying embers of the campfire remained, telling of human presence not long ago. Elizabeth, she shouted. Robert, this isn't funny. Only the forest absorbed her voice, and the darkness seemed to deepen. Jake suddenly pointed. Mom, there's something over there. Near the remaining embers a small lantern had been placed. It wasn't one they had been using. Under the light a piece of white paper was visible. Marion approached fearfully and picked up the paper with trembling hands. The familiar handwriting froze her heart like ice. You two can live here now. It was Elizabeth's handwriting. The message was simple and direct. No explanation, no apology, no excuse. Marion's head spun with confusion and fear. Why? She whispered. This had to be a nightmare. She frantically reached into her pocket but her smartphone was gone. She searched for her bag but that too had disappeared. All she had was the flashlight. Mom, I'm cold. Jake pressed against her. Where did Grandma and Grandpa go? When are they coming back? Marianne hugged Jake, feeling his small body trembling. Fear and anger swirled inside her but she had to remain calm in front of her son. It's okay, Jake, she said in the most gentle voice she could manage. There must be a reason. But deep down she understood there was no reason for such a cruel act. There could be no justification. As the darkness of night enveloped them, and the remaining embers gradually weakened, Marion and Jake were completely isolated in the unfamiliar forest. The time until dawn felt eternal to Marion. She put Jake to sleep near the remnants of the fire and stayed awake all night keeping watch. By the time sunlight filtered through the trees, her head was clouded with fatigue and fear. Mom, I'm hungry, Jake murmured as he woke up. Marion gently stroked her son's head and replied, I know, honey. I am too. But we don't have any food right now. When are Grandma and Grandpa coming back? That innocent question pained Marianne's heart. I don't know, Jake, but I think we need to find help on our own. She stood up and looked around. In the morning light, the campsite appeared even more isolated. She tried to find the path they had come on, but without any landmarks, she couldn't even determine which direction to go. Staying here won't bring anyone to us, Marianne decided. If we go downhill, we should eventually come across a road or a house. She put ash and charcoal from the remaining fire into a small backpack, took Jake's hand, and they began walking downhill. Marion tried to act as cheerful as possible, but inside she was trembling with fear. Being lost in the forest without food, water, or means of communication, with a 7-year-old child, she had never even imagined such a situation. Mom, what's that? Jake's voice brought Marianne back to reality. In the direction he was pointing, a small stream was flowing. Water, she exclaimed with relief. You're thirsty, aren't you? But don't drink directly from it. Wait until we can purify it. She tried to remember how to start a fire. Survival techniques she had seen on TV flashed through her mind. Maybe we can sterilize water using the sun's heat. But without proper containers, they couldn't purify the water adequately. Hunger and fatigue began to weaken Jake, and Marion had developed blisters on her feet. On the second day, they continued downhill along the stream. Marion searched for berries or edible plants, but she wasn't confident about what was safe and what was dangerous. Jake became increasingly quiet, occasionally whispering, I want to go home. On the morning of the third day, Marianne woke up feeling chills. The night dew and hunger had sapped her strength, and she was showing symptoms of mild fever. Still, she got up and encouraged the exhausted Jake to keep walking. Just a little more, Jake. We'll surely reach a place where people are. But she didn't believe her own words. The forest seemed endless, and they appeared to be moving deeper into it. By the afternoon of the fourth day, Marion's legs refused to move any further. They were resting in the shade of a small rock. Jake was sleeping with his head on her lap, and Marion looked up at the sky. Clouds were gathering, signaling rain. Elizabeth, why? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly she heard a dog barking in the distance. Marion listened carefully. It wasn't an auditory hallucination. It was definitely a dog's bark. Is anyone there? She shouted with all her might. Help, we're over here. The sound of branches being stepped on approached from the direction of the voice. Soon a large German shepherd appeared. Behind it, an elderly man emerged. "Hey, who's there?" the man asked in a cautious voice. "Please help us," Marion answered in a trembling voice. "We were abandoned." The man approached and frowned upon seeing their condition. "What happened?" "It's a long story. But my mother and stepfather, they left us in the forest and disappeared. Name's Raymond." The man introduced himself. "I live in a cabin about 3 miles from here. Let me take you there." Raymond's cabin was rustic but warm, and above all, safe. He was a former FBI investigator in his mid-70s who had chosen to live in the mountains after retirement. His dog Benji seemed to take an immediate liking to Jake. After a meal and a warm shower, Marion told Raymond the entire story, from her childhood when Elizabeth took her in, to her complex relationship with her stepfather Robert, to the events of this camping trip. Raymond listened silently, occasionally taking notes. "This isn't just a case of abandonment," he finally said. "There's another motive. Your mother and stepfather are wealthy, right?" Marion nodded. "Robert is a broker for a large insurance company. They both have considerable assets." "Insurance?" Raymond furrowed his brow. "Was any life insurance taken out on you and Jake?" Marion thought for a moment. "A few years ago, Elizabeth said she was getting insurance for Jake and me. She would be the beneficiary. She said it was in case something happened, to at least cover funeral expenses." "You don't mean?" Marion's expression changed. "Did they expect us to die?" "It's possible," Raymond said with a stern expression. "Starving to death, lost in the forest, or attacked by wild animals. If it could look like a natural death, they could collect the insurance. But we're here. We're alive." "Yes," Raymond stood up. "That's why we'll go to town tomorrow to investigate. But as a precaution, let's keep your presence here a secret." The next day, Raymond went to town alone and returned in the evening. His expression was grim. "Something unbelievable is happening," he said. According to the local newspaper, Marion Williams and her son Jake reportedly died in a tragic accident while camping. "What?" Marion exclaimed. "According to Elizabeth and Robert's testimony, you two went exploring near a waterfall at night but never returned. They claimed to have searched and found your belongings and blood traces near the river. No bodies were found, but authorities concluded you were swept away by the current." Marion was speechless. All the pieces were beginning to fit together in her mind. "They planned to kill us from the beginning." "It was a well-thought-out plan," Raymond said. "Fortunately, they don't know about my existence. That's our only advantage." That night, the phone at Raymond's cabin rang. Marion jumped in surprise. "Don't worry," Raymond reassured her. "Few people know this number." When he answered the phone, a woman's voice could be heard. After talking for a while, Raymond handed the phone to Marion. "It's your friend, a woman named Linda." "Marion? Is it really you?" Linda's voice trembled on the other end of the line. "Linda, how did you? I couldn't believe you were dead," Linda said tearfully. Elizabeth's story seemed off. "I went to her house saying I wanted to express my condolences. But she wasn't grieving at all, and she was already proceeding with lawyers and insurance paperwork." "Linda, we were nearly killed," Marianne said, fighting back tears. "I contacted Raymond. He used to work with my father. I thought he could help. Thank you. But please don't tell anyone we're here. If Elizabeth and Robert found out, I promise," Linda answered. "I'll help too. What do you need?" After hanging up, Marion looked at Raymond. The former FBI investigator's eyes held a determination she hadn't seen in a long time. "Now," Raymond said, "let's plan our revenge. We'll beat them at their own game." Outside the window, rain had begun to fall. But for the first time, a ray of hope shone in Marion's heart. She and Jake were no longer alone. "Would you like some coffee?" Linda said in Raymond's mountain cabin kitchen. She had joined them 2 days ago, and the cabin suddenly took on the atmosphere of an operations headquarters. "Thank you," Raymond answered without taking his eyes off his laptop. "Almost got it." Marion and Linda gathered behind him. Complex databases were displayed on the screen. "These are the secret servers of Robert's company," Raymond explained. "Some old colleagues helped me a bit. It's not legal, but given the circumstances, we had no choice." "Did you find anything?" Marion asked anxiously. "Your stepfather appears to be a respected insurance broker on the surface, but behind the scenes he's involved in large-scale tax evasion. And look at this." He opened a file. It displayed multiple insurance policies with Marion and Jake's names. $5 million for us?" Marion exclaimed in surprise. "That's not all." Raymond opened another file. "Elizabeth has already begun filing insurance claims for your deaths. The review process has just started, but payment is scheduled within 2 weeks. Unbelievable." Marion collapsed onto the sofa. "But why? They're already wealthy." "There's no limit to human greed," Raymond said coldly. "However, there's more important information." He opened another folder. Old legal documents and trust deeds were displayed. "This is records of your biological mother's trust property," Raymond explained. "Your mother, Elizabeth's sister, apparently had considerable assets. After her death, that property was supposed to be held in trust for you, who was a minor. But Elizabeth became your guardian and gained control. I never knew about this." Marion's face changed color. "She had an obligation to inform you." Instead, Raymond pointed to another file. "She had been siphoning off funds little by little each year. The amount you should have received when you turned 21 was less than half the original value. But why try to kill us now? The reason is here." Raymond opened the final file. "According to the trust terms, if anything happened to you before you turned 35, all remaining assets would transfer to your child. Elizabeth would remain the administrator. 35, Marion said in a trembling voice. I'm 32. In 3 more years. She couldn't wait, Linda said. She needed to eliminate you now to gain control over Jake and access all the funds. And the insurance money too, Raymond added, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. In Marion's mind, pieces of memory began to connect. Elizabeth's cold attitude, the occasional display of excessive affection, and her recent strange behavior. My mother knew Elizabeth was using me from the beginning. Tears welled up in her eyes. She took me in not out of love but for money. We have all the evidence. Raymond's voice strengthened. Now we can report this to the authorities. Wait, Marion suddenly stood up. Just reporting isn't enough for me. I want to confront them directly. I want to see with my own eyes their faces when they learn I'm alive and know the truth. Raymond thought for a moment. It's dangerous but might be possible. Some of my former colleagues will help, but timing is crucial. Right before the insurance payout, Linda suggested, when they're most off guard. The 3 planned late into the night. Raymond contacted former colleagues by phone to secure their cooperation. Linda was responsible for gathering information about movements in town. A few days later, Linda returned with important news. The insurance company has approved the payment. Next Wednesday, Elizabeth and Robert are scheduled to receive the check at the Boston headquarters. Perfect, Raymond said. Our trap is set. On the day of the plan, Marion sat in the back seat of Raymond's car, her hands trembling with tension. Jake had been left with a former colleague of Raymond's for safety. Are you okay? Raymond looked at her through the rearview mirror. Yes, no, but I have to do this. They arrived at a high-rise building in Boston. In the insurance company's luxurious lobby, Raymond showed his ID to the security guard. Former FBI Special Investigator Raymond Harris. I've brought a witness for an important fraud case. Investigator Brendan Murphy should be expecting us. The guard made a phone call and promptly escorted them upstairs. In front of the conference room door, Marion took a deep breath. Ready? Raymond asked quietly. Marion nodded. The end of 15 years of deception. The door opened, and they entered. Elizabeth and Robert were sitting on the other side of a large table, talking with several men in suits. They looked happy, with triumphant expressions. Elizabeth noticed first. The blood drained from her face and she froze as if she had seen a ghost. Hello, Elizabeth, Marion said in a calm voice. Did you forget about us? Robert suddenly stood up and tried to head for the exit, but the door opened, and 2 police officers entered. Robert Williams and Elizabeth Williams, one officer said. You are under arrest on suspicion of fraud, false death reporting, attempted murder, and tax fraud. Elizabeth's eyes remained fixed on Marion. How? She said in a hoarse voice. How did I survive? Marion smiled. I had a reason to protect my son, something you wouldn't understand. As the police handcuffed Elizabeth and Robert, Marion watched their faces crumble. After a 10-month-long trial, the day of the verdict finally came. Marion stood next to her lawyer looking at Elizabeth and Robert. The 2 had hired separate attorneys and had developed a situation where they were blaming each other. Defendant Elizabeth Williams, the jury has found you guilty on all counts of fraud, attempted murder, and tax evasion, the judge said sternly. This court sentences you to 20 years in prison. Elizabeth momentarily looked like she might collapse but quickly straightened her back. Her eyes were cold as ice, and her expression showed no remorse as she looked at Marion. Defendant Robert Williams, the jury has also found you guilty on similar charges. This court sentences you to 15 years in prison. Robert covered his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking. During the trial, he had testified about Elizabeth's other illegal activities, seeking leniency. However, that wasn't enough to save him entirely. Outside the courthouse, Marion placed her hand on Jake's shoulder and smiled at Raymond and Linda. It's over, she said quietly. Justice has prevailed. Raymond nodded. Your new life begins. A few days later, Marion formally took over the management of the trust property at her lawyer's office. Some of the funds Elizabeth had embezzled would be returned. Also, all the fraudulent insurance contracts taken out in her and Jake's names were canceled. I heard Elizabeth has the worst reputation in the women's prison, Linda said, drinking coffee in Marion's apartment. She was talking with Marion in the kitchen after reading a book to Jake. Other inmates call her the witch who tried to kill her daughter and grandson. I can't feel sorry for her, Marion shrugged. Besides, she's not my real mother. What happened to Robert? I heard he's talking about Elizabeth's other crimes to get early parole. The hatred between them seems to be deepening. It's ironic, Linda said. 2 people who betrayed family for money end up betraying each other. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall. The arrival of winter in Boston. Marianne looked out the window, holding a warm drink. Next week, we're moving to our new house, she said. Jake is very excited. It's the first house with his own yard. You look happy, Linda said, observing her friend's expression. Yes, strangely enough. After such a terrible experience, I'm full of gratitude now. Because I learned the true meaning of family. The doorbell rang, and Raymond came in, brushing off snow. He had a large gift box in his arms. Jake, look, a gift for your new home. Raymond. Jake ran over excitedly. What's inside? Open it and see. As Jake tore the wrapping paper, a model house kit emerged. Awesome, will you build it with me? Of course, little architect, Raymond laughed. Watching them, Marion quietly vowed in her heart. This was her real family. A family bound not by blood but by love and trust. Mom, look. Jake shouted happily. Grandpa Raymond brought a miniature of our new house. That's wonderful, Marion smiled. Our new home, the beginning of our new life. Outside the window, snow continued to fall silently, turning their new memories white. Having overcome the darkness of the past, a bright future stretched out before Marion and Jake, and they were never alone again.